All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Science Luncheon. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Marlen Zoraida Gonzalez. I think I missed the name though.
Yep.
Assistant Professor of Psychology at Cornell University. Dr. Gonzalez is a pioneering researcher whose work bridges behavioral ecology, neuroscience, and community engagement. She leads the Life History Lab at Cornell, where her team investigates how developmental environments, social, physical, and economic, shape neural sensitivity to reward, stress, and social connection. Her research uses cutting-edge methods, including neuroimaging, psychophysiology, and molecular analysis to explore how early life experiences shape adult brain function and behavior. As the executive director of the Community Neuroscience Initiative, Dr. Gonzalez is also deeply committed to democratizing science and fostering meaningful partnerships between researchers and the communities that they serve. Her approach, which she calls community neuroscience, emphasizes the reciprocal relationships between scientific discovery and social empowerment. She brings a unique and holistic perspective to understanding cognition, development, and well-being across the lifespan, and we're very excited to having her here today. So please welcome me and join me in welcoming Dr. Gonzalez.
So sweet. That's one of my favorites. Good job. My full name, just five of them. I'm from the Dominican Republic. It's very common for you to have both your mom and your dad's last name. But my publishing name is just Marlen Gonzalez. I thought it was awesome that you guys actually included more of my names. That is actually true, which is like, whoa, that's weird. That's me. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I want to start off with just gratitude. This is partially because it's a better way to start a presentation instead of ending it, but also just because it helps nerves. That's what I've heard in the research. So I'd like to just point out that science is a team sport. I literally cannot do it without of course, my lab members and graduate students, but also community members, funding sources, and people who look at your weird stuff and say yeah, you should try that, So I really want to take a moment to just thank them here, and these folks they'll be sprinkled around in the presentation. So I really have two goals, essentially, in this presentation, which maybe I should have only had one goal, but here we are. This is both about how context matters in terms of how we understand the brain, but also the matters of context in the sense of the way that we do our science. So you've set me up really well in that I will be talking about essentially my two babies, which is the work that we do in the Life History Lab, applying behavioral ecology to understanding brain and brain development, and then also the Community Neuroscience Initiative and this idea of democratizing science. Why is it good for communities, and why is it good for science itself? And what I hope to show you is the ways in which the science that I do and the science that others around me do is enhanced essentially by having this participatory and community-oriented So we will essentially have 4 sections. First, really introducing behavioral ecology, showcasing empirical research, and then talking about science democratization and sort of what we do with that. Like, what does it actually look like at the ground level? So we'll start with this idea that context matters in terms of understanding the neural responses that you're seeing in, for example, but also psychophysiology. The idea that have individual differences in the neural response to whatever your stimuli are, and that these actually reflect something about the way that we see the world. I don't actually think I need to convince anyone here that the brain is context sensitive. I don't think I have to convince anyone here that maybe the skills and strategies and tactics that you use in one context are going to be different than what's used in another context. Maybe some of the problems are still the same. You still have to eat, but the sort of challenge, how much of a challenge that is, and what are the strategies that you use in order to get that done are just going to be different. What I do think maybe I can do a little bit convincing on is thinking about, okay, but how? How do I research something as complex as how individuals navigate through space, challenges, use social and physical resources to essentially survive and continue in the world and live their lives. And for that, I'd like to introduce behavioral ecology. And because ecology is already used in psychology, ecological psychology, eco-psych, psychological ecology, there's all these different sort of ways in which people talk about neuroecology, ecological neuroscience, not the same. I think it's worthwhile to do this exercise. So first, I actually want to introduce you to sake. I would like you all to just think in your mind right now, what is sake? Just picture it. We're picturing it. Okay. Audience participation is good. So I think when most people think about sake, what are you actually picturing? What's sake?
A white carafe with warm liquid in it.
Yeah, this is sake, the Japanese character for it. Here's what sake actually is. It's actually all alcohol intelligence. So in the original Japanese language, sake refers to any kind of alcohol. And the thing that we call sake is actually a specific type called nihonshu. It's a rice wine fermented. This is an example of semantic narrowing, where you have something in its native form, which includes sort of this panoply of different, factors or different types that are in one sort of place. But then as it navigates, right, as it gets adopted elsewhere, it then becomes narrower and narrower to the point that what we think of as sake is in fact only one type of alcohol in Japan. So I'm basically going to ask us to instead take this like uncarved block example, because what we have in psychology more generally are basically a bunch of semantic narrowings about what behavioral ecology is. So I'm going to try to blow it up a bit more and get to the source. So in general, behavioral ecology is just really simple. It's really the science of how animal behaviors and behavioral plasticity essentially is an intermediary to fitness, to survival and production. Again, thinking about what are the tactics and strategies that you use to solve the problems of living. And it maintains that any living thing, me and the lizard, have certain problems that we all have to solve by virtue of just being alive. So again, biggest one is I have to consume more energy than I expend, otherwise I will die. And this is a constraint, a bioenergetic constraint. There are certain amounts of energies that I need to have in order to be able to produce a behavior or to grow or to reproduce, whatever it is. And so we're really concerned with that. Now, I want to be clear, obviously, this is a subset of biology. And as the famous saying goes, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. So it is true that when I'm saying to adapt the original behavioral ecology, does mean that you are getting into the very sticky, pretty disgusting waters of the ways in which evolutionary theory, and especially natural selection, has been applied to human beings in order to promote white supremacy, sexism, and just other forms of oppression. I think I'm going to go a little bit into like, oh, that makes absolutely no sense. Many of these tenets, we are in a tree, we are not in a hierarchy, we're literally all related to each other. And there's like no real, there's no such thing as race, for example. I don't know if I might get in trouble in Texas for saying that, but it's true, biologically speaking. I think a good place to go if you really want to get deep into this is really Kevin Leyland and Jillian Brown wrote this beautiful book, Sense and Nonsense, where it just goes through every single basically application and the pros and cons, and tries to get to like, how do we actually use this, right? How do we reclaim this in a way that is helpful? Because at the end of the day, this is pretty powerful, because what it's saying is, instead of putting everything on the individual and individual physiology and individual behaviors, what you have to really think about is the entirety of the context, both the sort of current context, as in like, what are we doing right now, the food, right, the availability of things, but also the evolutionary history. What is our physiology kind of suited for at a baseline? What is it primed for? Because that's going to matter in terms of what behaviors and what we're going to execute, but also what behaviors end up being, quote, good for us. So I think a lot of the issue is a really fundamental misunderstanding of what fitness is. Behavior is an intermediary to fitness, but fitness is an outcome, not a trait. So often people hear, oh, survival of the fittest. That makes no sense. You are not fit and then survive. You survive, you reproduce, and you are said to be fit. Your actual like health is related to that, but technically, actually, you can decouple it, right? If you're a sperm donor, boom, you're fit, so long as you have had viable, offspring. But in regular human life, that's not usually, what we've done. It's coupled with other things, right? And so fitness is an outcome. It's a yardstick. I am not fit. I don't have kids. Unless my rabbit counts, it doesn't count, actually. I don't have kids, so I am not said to be fit. The other important thing is that fitness is emergent, right? So for a trait to be fit, it's not exactly about its goodness and badness, right? So we tend to, especially in psychology, have judgments about traits. So the idea that being a risk taker is necessarily, right, a bad sort of trait, of course, it's related to all sorts of outcomes, certainly teenagers, driving, right? It's not that it isn't related to negative things, but that it happens in context. Because risk taking may be essential and important when you don't have, when you have unpredictable resources, for example. You need to, get it while the getting is good. People are not promised that you'll have another chance, right? So really, how this trait is good or bad, i.e., prioritizes your survival, your health, your reproduction, is really in line with whatever is happening in the environment at the time. The other thing is, even if a trait is said to be, or behaviors are said to be fitness enhancing, they all incur some sort of trade-off. It may be worthwhile, but they all incur some sort of trade-off. It's really just like if you are eating, you are also expending energy in order to eat. You're also not doing other things. It's inevitable. You are making choices, and there's finite resources. And so by definition, if you are doing one behavior, there's a whole cluster of other things that you are not doing, right? Okay. I think this is best shown through an example. And while you're eating, I should talk about lactose intolerance. Why not? So we can ask this question: is eating dairy? Well, if I look at this Cleveland Clinic depiction of lactose intolerance, it does seem pretty bad. And also 2/3 of the adult population actually cannot digest lactose, right? So it's in dairy products, especially milk. So in some sense, if we just look at it as non-contextually, and we just say, well, the numbers are, for 2/3 of the entire human population, this is not a good thing, right? It causes all sorts of distress, then we shouldn't do it, right? This is where the context part happens. So first of all, we move away from thinking about, is it bad? It's more like, well, has, the ability to digest dairy, has it enhanced fitness somehow? And we really need to think about under what conditions. Lactose intolerance, as along with being uncomfortable, literally means that you cannot get the energy from this food. You cannot get energy from this food source. That's a serious issue if that is a major food source. So people have looked at essentially what is the phylogeny or like the genetics essentially of being able to eat dairy even into adulthood. And you cannot see that very well. What I want to show you is, in general, people always think that Europeans and Northerners, so in this case, sorry guys, in this case, so you have like Irish, Spanish, they actually have a very low level of intolerance. So for the most part, they can digest this. But you also see this in African communities, like in Rwanda. You also even see it in individual communities, like there's two types of Fulani communities. And what separates these populations, so this is like essentially the percentage in the population, the proportion of the population that can actually do this weird thing, which again, in other animals also, in adulthood, they become lactose intolerant. And what really separates them is pastoralism. When did these groups start essentially animal husbandry and getting animal products on there? So this is a person from the pastoralist Fulani people. So for the Fulani people, the ones that became pastoralists, they're going to have a higher ability to actually use this lactose, right? Suggesting that in this case, but not in other cases, something happened in order to, well, one, you had animal husbandry, but something else must have happened in order to exert intense pressure on this trait becoming more common. You needed to eat this. And therefore, if you were able to eat it, you were able to survive, you were able to reproduce, right? So you can map these things out also geographically, and I think that's important. And you can even look, so you can say, well, maybe it's just the climate, and that's really what's putting this together. You can look even close where you have things that are quite near each other, but again, it's actually the cultural practice and the technology, right? So literally the human behavior that is shaping whether this lactose tolerance thing is useful or not. So this illustrates, again, the idea behavior is an intermediary to fitness. And actually, in these analyses, they've shown that the behavior changed first. So there was animal husbandry that happened. There appears to be some sort of pressure, maybe drought, for example. And then you see the proliferation of this ability to consume lactose and make use of the nutrient. Again, that's really the part that matters above all, is that this nutrition is there. And then, of course, this is an emergent construct. So aside from, I just think it's really cool because this is data from all around the world, it does also illustrate other principles from behavioral ecology. Again, the idea that there are selection pressures, energy trade-offs, this idea called the niche, I haven't really talked about. For selection pressures, you have abiotic and biotic selection pressures. These are the things that are essentially going to impact your survival and reproductive. So again, a drought seems to have been, droughts and other things might be what really selects for lactose tolerance, because you needed to be able to eat this or drink milk in order to make up for other things that weren't around. But also biotic, the very idea that so biotic things are like the population density, and yes, the presence of other animals. And our ability to actually use these animals and for the animals to also be able to be around us is in itself a pressure, right? It comes with trade-offs. Yes, we get energy from these food products, but we also have to expend the time and resources in order to essentially grow and maintain these things, these animals. Also, you have pathogens that could go and wipe out our population because you have some zoonotic kinds of exchange. There's a trade-off. It's not necessary that being a pastoralist is always going to lead to population growth, or that lactose tolerance is always going to be meaningful. It's really everything is happening in The final thing that I think is important to think about is this idea of a niche. A niche is not just an environment, but it's rather, again, this relational kind of, it's a relational sort of process, right? So it's not just what is in my environment, but it's also like, what do we eat? How do we interact with the environment? And in general, what are our traits? So the human niche is things like we are omnivorous, we're extractive because we can do things like animal husbandry, like agriculture. But the thing that I really want to focus is this fact that we are deep, deep social. And when I say social, this is going to have it because it's a niche, right? And it has to do with bioenergetics. This is going to affect us at a very, very low level of analysis. Okay. I have very specific ways in which I kind of put these things together. But I do want to say there are some general things that I really hope others kind of adopt. In terms of like when we're looking at application, if we want to like do research on climate change, having shared language about ecology can be really important. Psychologists know a lot about behavioral change. We know less about things like human-made anthropogenic climate change and how to get and understanding how that changes relationships, like how birds migrate and the things that they eat and what are some of the consequences. So I think it can be really useful, but also the research really demands this idea of like context specificity, that we shouldn't not sort of try to keep things isolated on its own, but instead try to understand it in the context of what are the problems that are being solved, what are the resources that are available. So in my lab, in particular, I really try to look at what behavioral ecology is at. So I look at environmental pressures, both the biotic and abiotic, in other words, like the physical and social environment. So I might not be looking at droughts, but instead I look at like city planning. I heard a lot about how Dallas has not so great city planning currently, and driving is a real stressor, a real abiotic stressor right now for folks. And then also thinking about social relationships, because you're not just in the space, there's also all sorts of rules about who's allowed to use space, what, where's there's threats. So talk a lot about how like this idea of affordances, right? Green spaces like this has a ton of affordances in terms of like involved, be with your friends, blah, blah, blah. But for example, here, if I don't have access, if I can't pay for it, then I don't have that affordance. It may exist, but that doesn't mean it's accessible to me. You can take it further into the realm of like, you might have a green space, but you're more likely to have the cops called on you if you are from a minoritized race, right? These are ways in which you have these things like a net in water, where yes, the physical space, technically abiotic and biotic, right? Social and physical can separate them, but really they tend to interact with each other because especially humans really police the way that space. So I look at that and then I'm interested in these health outcomes. I don't have time to go all the way into like when children have babies and whether those babies have babies, although those studies are definitely being done. But I am interested in general how these environmental pressures are related to health outcomes, with the idea that the processes and the biological strategies, those intermediaries, are ultimately related to these ideas of fitness, but it ends up sort of like, even if it's useful in fitness, it might still lead to poor health outcomes. And while genetics doesn't care whether you have a nice life or not, it just cares, again, that you survive and reproduce. I care that you have a nice life. So this is the way that I do it. So for processes, we look at things like vigilance. We look at reward and risk-taking, self-regulation, so on and so forth. And then we look also at biological strategy. And I am really highlighting this reward, risk, and central nervous system because it's where I have done most of my work, including recently we looked at some work looking at essentially developmental context and whether you have this SR is like a socially rich group versus an economically rich group. all going to university. And what you see is, right, like they all ended up in the same place, right? So they're in the same context right now, but they're coming from very different developmental backgrounds. And while behaviorally in this risk-taking task, they're sort of the same, the level of risk-taking, the neural strategies are different. So you see that as loss aversion increases, so that means that like I'm basically not taking as much risk. For those individuals who were socially rich but economically poor, there's actually greater neural response that's sort of associated with this behavior of loss aversion. Same behavior, but a different cost to it. You just moved along. Great slide. And that would be great if I had chosen to that, but instead I'm going to talk about some weird stuff that I just have to process. In particular, thinking about self-regulation, central nervous system, and blood glucose. Okay, walk with me here. All right, behavior ecology. Keep that in mind. This whole idea of niche, all of it's going to come back again. All right, so very specifically, this idea of social affordances and bioenergetic management. In other words, how does the presence of other people around me change some of my behaviors, nutrition behavior, fitness as in behavior, but also the way sort of these neural strategies that I'm talking about, right? And in order to sort of get to that point, I think behavioral ecology, the first thing is you have to think about is the animal. What type of animal is it? My animal happens to be this big brain primate that we call human. So I want to think a lot about like what defines us. And one of the things that define us is that we are really socially dependent. So there's this concept of attritional versus social. So attritional basically means we are useless as babies. That giraffe, there's actually a picture of that little baby giraffe like licking off the moms like after birth, like being really helpful right away. Versus you have this baby that it's going to take years. And in fact, when it comes to the brain, about 25 to 28 years of feeding, clothing, doing all these things in order to grow to its full size and be, essentially have their own output into society. So this is a heavy investment that actually cannot be done alone for beings. We are communal leaders. We actually need to subsidize each other when it comes to growth and reproduction. So anthropological evidence has looked at things like cooperative hunting and scavenging and the way that has impacted essentially longevity and how much weight you put on. Communal cooking, so the ability to actually, again, divide what we're doing and make food process easier. That's going to, again, raise our nutritional values and our ability to survive. It's, again, constantly tied to that bioenergetic factor. And then the big one, alloparental care. Human beings literally need other human beings in order to raise children. So one of the beautiful things, and this is rare actually all of these are rarish in the animal kingdom, is that we actually have like related folks, yes, but even strangers like take care of our babies. That's not a thing for many other animals, even within family systems where they have to keep the young away because they actually might be big. Whereas for us, we will take care of each other's children, and this is essential to mom being able to get better and for the child to grow, because it would not be possible for a human mom and even a human mom and dad alone to get the necessary things that you need to have survive. So you are all doing something that is very odd in the animal kingdom, as you are sharing with each other, and you're not looking to see if somebody else is stealing stuff from you. So again, all of this has led to the subsidizing of brain expansion and brain growth, which suggests that maybe just maybe, the real kind of niche for humans might actually be other people. One important way to think about a niche is that it is the moment in which your energy expenditure is lowest. It's like It's like the perfect coat that you wear. Everything is fine and fits. There's no excess, right? It's optimized for things. And the idea is that maybe the brain is actually optimized in a sense to have others nearby, but that is when it's most at rest, both because of our evolutionary history, but because we are attritional, which means that we always have people. It's odd for us to actually be alone because we need each other. So in a set of studies, actually looked at this. So there's simple manipulation. You see an X or an O, and then that indicates, X indicates a probability that you might get shot, right? And then you're either doing that by yourself or you're doing that holding the hand of a partner. When you are alone, and we're looking here in the DLPFC and the posterior cingulate cortex, I'm going to pay more attention to the DLPFC because it's this sort of like very strong self-regulatory region. It's very expensive neural tissue, but it's also very flexible. And what you find is that when you're alone, you have this higher threat response than when you're with a partner. The threat is the same. It's a threat of shock. Nothing has changed about that. What is different about it is just the context. You happen to be holding the hand of a partner, and then you see this sort of reduction in neural response. That sounds great. Okay, social context. We lower our defenses in a sense, right? We yield, this is why we call it yield to others, sort of the problems of living, so do it, right? Well, I can't always be good. Maybe that's just my psychology. So I really wanted to look at yielding, this idea that you would relax your physiological response to a threat as this kind of individual difference that did more than just like, oh, it's just differences in neural response, but actually suggested whether one had a more self-regulatory, so individualistic, or kind of communal attitude or bigger repertoire of how you dealt with stress. The reason for that is because there is this trade-off that we have. So you guys are socially tolerant, congratulations. Not all animals have that. For those who are socially tolerant, they can eat next to each other. They have this trade-off. It's called the vigilance and foraging trade-off. Essentially, if we're all together foraging, that means there's more pairs of eyes that are also on the lookout for predators. And if you're looking out for predators, then I can forage more. What does that result in? A net gain in essentially nutritional resources. And you see this across animals who are socially tolerant, from good old chimps that we, and bonobos actually, that we like to compare ourselves to, but also things like zebras, wildebeest, kangaroos, they all do it. It's great, that's awesome. So now we are all going to share this vigilance, and then we're going to forage. There is a trade-off. I assume that you're looking out for a predator, but maybe you're not actually. Maybe there's actually some sort of social loafing. So it doesn't, the sort of vigilance foraging trade-off also involves a possibility that predation, because you're not on the lookout, you're expecting somebody else's. Predation might be higher. And here's the other thing. For animals who engage in this, are also more likely to have essentially marginalization and victimization. So theft of food is a big one. I think it's called, literally, it's so common in this kind of thing that it has a name. It's like kleptosymbiosis or something like that. It's a whole phenomenon. You also have group-dwelling animals where literally when they sleep, they will put essentially some at the margins. Why? Because they're more likely to get victimized by both predators, but also actually there's a trade-off to all of this. If you're not using your personal resources to be vigilant, right, someone else can take advantage of you. Okay, so looking at this through this same paradigm, so we do, and we get this measurement of yielding, the degree to which you have this relaxation of the neural response to threat because of a relational threat. And then use that as a predictor of the neural response to a social threat. In this case, social rejection. If you're familiar with the cyberball paradigm, you are playing a ball tossing game, and eventually they stop including you. Turns out the brain goes on fire when you social reject someone. And then we looked at coping strategies 2 years post this scan. What we find is essentially that first, in these areas that we consider sort of regulatory, especially the dorsal frontal cortex and the DACC, you see variation. Even though as a group, we all sort of healed, you have individual differences on the extent to which you see that sort of lowering of the regulatory kind of action. And then it's like a rich gets richer scheme. So in the x-axis is the DLPFC reduction, essentially activation in terms of hand-holding. And then what you see is that as you have this lower hand-holding response, you are essentially getting also this lower response to social rejection. So higher yielding, lower response to social rejection. Kind of the idea would be here that maybe there's some sort of conservation of energy, which the body loves to do. By conserving energy while I'm with a friend, that capacity and that action allows me to also be more efficient when it comes to being by myself. Rich get richer, so to speak. Looking further into actual behaviors, so on the x-axis, we have, again, yielding score and then self-regulation with using the brief cope. And then we have these measures of essentially the neural response to social rejection and the DLPFC again. And what you find is that, one, as expected, the higher your yielding score, the actually lower you are in terms of like solely using self-regulation as a strategy. I don't have it here, but I did the analysis where essentially individuals who are highest in yielding appear to be using different strategies flexibly, including, by the way, strategies that are normally we think of as like avoidance, right? So like sometimes they engage in a little drinking, just make themselves feel better. But it's very varied. Nothing is like just one thing. In contrast, you have this kind of low yielding different phenotypes, but the thing I actually want to focus on is this very odd kind of light blue line. So these individuals are socially insensitive. When there's a partner there, they're like, I don't get much from this. There's not much yielding, right? But also when there's a threat, they're not particularly sensitive to social threat either. And these individuals, right? So neurally, they seem to be insensitive to the sort of social threat or the social resource. These individuals are using self-regulation strategy at zero, almost exclusively using just self-regulation. In other words, they're like, I'm not going to trust you to be vigilant, and instead, I'm going to do it myself, right? This is a pretty reasonable type of strategy, right? Except for the fact that if you continue to do this, right? If you continue to be socially disconnected, you are actually not working with what is often in terms of being a communal being. So then it makes sense that you have things like, the famous Holt-Lundstedt studies where social disconnection is as bad for you as, smoking 2 packs a day while you have like heart disease, right? Social connection ends up being really, really important to our bodies. And one of the reasons I think that might be is that at a very low level, bioenergetic sense, other human beings, right, constitute part of a strategy to solving the problems of living. So that's all well and good, but I really wanted to go, but does it actually lead to differences in nutrition, to the way the brain processes nutrition, to the nutrition behaviors that we do? And so I call this sort of idea social nutrition. I came up with this in 2019, and the project was delayed because of the pandemic. But the idea was really first born out of the fact that it did seem that actually individuals increased, especially their carbohydrate intake, as a function of loneliness and also avoidance. And this was also associated with free-flowing glucose, again, suggesting this individualized strategy. I need to have free energy available in order to deal with the problem. Related to that is the idea of kangaroo care. So kangaroo care is as effective, sometimes more effective than using incubators for preemie babies. So that skin-to-skin contact appears to particularly help the nervous system. Again, I would think, conserve energy so that it can do the other things that it needs to do, grow, right? And this has long-lasting sort of effects. At the same time, there was research that showed that essentially you get some very similar effects from drinking a glucose concoction, again, matching for taste, that you do from hand holding. In other words, you actually see, again, a reduction in these areas, especially the DLPFC and PACC, suggesting that there's something about the brain sort of being like, oh, all right, I don't have to do as much because I actually have the resources available. And later on, other things came up with things like your diet tends to be more carbohydrate heavy and processed if you eat dyadically. You look at the ways in for a daily diet sort of study, you look at partner conflict, and then you have more snacking behavior. There really does seem to be this tying in of your sort of social connection state and this sort of nutrition kind of behavior. And that nutrition behavior similarly is in. Okay, but this is not done in one study. So I really wanted to do the study where I really explicitly looked at sort of the neural response to nutrition versus this social resource. Are there areas of the brain that to them is like, all resource to me, I don't really need to differentiate this, right? So we did this study I called a social nutrition study. Manu, he actually gave a talk here. So as my postdoc, he really revived the study again. It was sitting from 2019. And then my wonderful graduate students and an army of undergrads really did this. And because Manu is so kind, he was like, make sure you highlight these folks because they did so much work. So I definitely want to say thank you to everyone. Again, science is a team sport. All right, so this study is kind of complex. I'm not going to make it better. But essentially you have 38 dyads, a little bit small, but still we're getting something from here. We look for high quality relationships. They can be of any type of relationship so long as it's a strong relationship and greater than a year together. The exclusions are basically your regular conflict. These individuals looked at, we looked at or measured developmental and current sort of resources. I'm just highlighting some of the neighborhood factors, which I always look at. And then this idea of experiences in close relationship, right? Attachment avoidance, some mental health, and then looking at blood glucose. We also have some full metabolic panel. I won't talk about it, but we're looking at health outcomes. And then really the big kicker is this fMRI whole study. Component. And in particular, instead of looking at threat of shock, we started to look at cognitive load. The idea being that this sort of yielding effect might be general, because again, if it's vigilance and foraging, then maybe the fact that you're around also helps me in terms of working memory because I am taking things, resources that would go to vigilance, and it's going instead to remembering essentially for this part. And so for that reason, along with the fact that the glucose study also used an MBAC test, so not spatial, I use this sort of cognitive load now as the stressor here. And we looked at the usual things. So we always have pre-back condition is very hard. Every single one, it's saying, did you see this 3 times ago? So you have to update your memory to be able to say, which one was 3 times ago? Oh, I remember it. Okay, yes, this is true. I did see this 3 times ago. It's extremely hard. But because we use a lot of university students, they're like, this is it. This is the level that you need. It is meant to be frustrating. Everybody hates it. It's extremely fatiguing. So that's one of the things that we looked at. And then you have the zero back condition, which is just, is it in the center or not, essentially. So at the same time, they are doing this sort of paradigm. They are receiving resources. One of them is through a gustometer. They're going to essentially receive a tastant, so literally like a drop of liquid falls into their mouths. You can see why post-COVID world would make it very hard to do some of these things, or they're holding the hand of a partner. So you end up with these 4 conditions. We always start with the placebo and hand-holding. So this is like no resources, you're by yourself. This is the common cognitive neuroscience. You are by yourself and you are doing a task in fact. And then we counterbalance the other conditions where you have either the social resource by itself and the maltodextrin, the carb, so the nutrition by itself, or you have both together. And you can look at the ways in which these different contexts and the presence of the resources changes the neural response. So again, we're looking at cognitive load, our regions of interest at the DLPFC and ACC. So this is, we can't do a regular kind of subtraction paradigm in this, because if we believe that the brain instantiates the social resource and nutritional resources similarly, then actually you would just get a null effect, right? So instead we have to use this fancy kind of stuff called representation similarity analysis. But essentially you're taking something into features, what's called feature-based. So you're defining things based on be any number of features, and you are placing them on some sort of continuum. And after you place them on this continuum, like how much of this feature and that feature do they have, repeated about 1,000 times, depending on how many features you need, you can then look at the distance between them. And what we would expect, right, based on our analyses, is that the distance between any one of these 2 resources, right, nutrition and social, for the DACC and the DLPFC, they're going to be more like each other than not. And the other ones are going to be dissimilar. And I think this is really cool. This is actually what we find. So looking at the clustering analysis, we see that the distance between the neural sort of response to either one of these individual nutrition conditions is closer than the other one. You can do it this way. You can also, so this is essentially like bottom up. Let's just see how do these things relate to each other and emotional space. You can also fit different kinds of models into it. So you can propose a sort of like how the matrix should look. So ours is more here, the nutrition amount, which is just saying that individual handholding and individual maltodextrin by itself are more similar to each other than any of the other ones. But you could have something general where, for example, also the hand-holding and maltodextrin together is going to be the same for all of them. In the same way that you would in a regular regression sort of model, you can build these things and then you can compare models to each other. And again, we find from this sort of method that we see the nutrition amount, our model is the thing that pops up. Same thing, the nutrition amounts ends up being like, if you combine all the things together, that tends to be the most predictive factor. Importantly, there's individual differences. So you actually have more dissimilarity with less secure attachment, so more anxious and more anxious and more avoidant attachment. Will have more dissimilarity, right? Again, suggesting there's some sort of calibration going on. And so this really gets us to thinking that maybe there's something to this idea that, like, yes, in general, there does seem to be, again, in these neural regions, it's not the same for the hypothalamus, guys, I checked, it knows. But at least in these upper level neural regions, especially the DLPFC, where decision-making is sort of happening, it's all abstracted into, at least from nutrition and social presence, as like resource. I do a thing, right? So there's something there that it feels good, or that might be true, and then that it is also again modulated by sort of how you represent other human beings, the extent to which they actually are a resource to you. The so what of this is like, well, before there was a male loneliness epidemic, like there's just a loneliness epidemic in general, and social disconnection may actually be related to some of the cardiometabolic diseases that we see on the rise. You have things like type 2 diabetes because people are consuming sugars, possibly to make up for a compromised niche, essentially. And importantly, this is not hitting people the same, right? So in contexts where you already have a lack of like other alternatives to nutritious sort of things, it's going to get harder. And the more stressors you are and the more things that keep people apart, you're going to have a sort of the kind of effects that I talked about with like marginalization, right? Like marginalization is biologically embedded. Okay, as expected, I'm going to skip an entire study. So this is important, right? I just said this is important. So I just tell NIH that this is important and that's it? No, I don't think so. This is where we go into the science democratization, sort of my philosophy on it, and this thing I created called the Community Neuroscience Initiative. Now, if you're interested in getting like more in depth and actually getting tools and backgrounds and all of this, please do read this paper. It was just recently published in Developmental Psychobiology, and it really goes through the philosophy, the background, and like practical tips and tricks. It's got a reading list for you. It's set up, guys. So I created the Community Neuroscience Initiative because I had seen the way that neuroscience, especially developmental neuroscience, has been used in order to actually make policy decisions, right? So I don't know if you guys remember, but around the time of this, especially big headlines on border crisis, where the kids were being separated from parents, developmental like neuroscience was weighing in a lot on that. And that's great in a sense, except that if you don't understand, right, if you're just an average person and you don't understand why these decisions are being made, why is my kid having to go to school later in the day, for example? That's another thing that developmental neuroscientists did. It's a problem. It's a problem of essentially what's called epistemic justice. So the idea of epistemic justice is the right to access, understand, and participate in the knowledge creation and its benefit, right? And in particular, I'm interested in this idea of distributive epistemic justice, right? So there's an equal distribution. It's not just me that can, say, hey, Senator, these are all the ways in which I disagree with you, and actually I have all this background, so, right? I need to be able to share that with others, because this is a thing that sometimes people really forget. The root of democracy demands essentially epistemology, a shared epistemology. Like epistemic justice is at the root of democracy, because how do you make decisions collectively if you do not have the same information? It's a very serious problem, right? Science is one of those pieces of information. Science is also not value-free. What we pursue is related to what we value, and what is valued also by funding agencies. It's not as if the public without training can just consume our work and there's nothing, right? And then they can easily consume it. Science democratization, therefore, is not just about science communication, although that's part of it, right? You need to get the word out there, but you actually need to share power and responsibility with folks. You need to actually have individuals in the community at the creation, dissemination, application of your work. And there are numerous examples of like how this actually becomes powerful and good for science in and of itself. It creates a more rigorous science, but it's also good for democracy, as again, people have this shared epistemology and are able to collectively like deal with reality and make decisions. And in my own sort of work, I have, on the one hand, a lot of what CNI does is essentially, we do accessible neuroscience lectures. We go into classrooms to help teachers teach neuroscience, especially around things like emotion regulation, right? So very applied. We work with the Parkinson Foundation to raise money, so on and so forth. A lot of it is just communal engagement, and we also have qualitative research and things that go on. The point of this is actually to put partnerships before projects. So I'm often in these schools because someone asked me to, not because I'm doing a project. In fact, I actually don't collect research. I don't in these schools, but I am interested in the empowering acts of having kids, especially with the schools that I work with, having kids, especially minoritized kids, to see neuroscience as theirs. right? That everyone feels like, oh, I am somebody who can understand this and I'm not afraid of it. So when you hit that 7th grade mark where everybody's like, I'm too dumb for science, generally women, they're actually, it's like something that they own, right, on there. And we see even in our little community how we do this. We do things like community advisory boards. These are often just me talking to people because I have them on my phone. But also you can have community advisory boards where you show your research and then you get feedback that is targeted. How do you recruit people? Please don't use those words. That's gross. Explain this better to me, right? You get a lot of feedback on it, and it's paid because it is their time and attention. Other folks have used also this kind of setup. So for example, Elizabeth Riley does Alzheimer's research. She's really wonderful. She basically like exponentially increased the representation of African Americans in Alzheimer's research. It's very low representation by working with a community action board. And this has all sorts of repercussions in terms of the representation and rigor and relevance of our work, right? She always shares it, so all of her participants like see the updates. I also have a student who works with the Parkinson's Foundation and empowers Parkinson's. And again, we're just showing up, right? We meet every month. We're talking to different providers. But what's interesting is then he did a study, and within 1 week, you had 45 participants who wanted to be a part of his work. Why? Because they really wanted to know about neuromelanin? No, because it was him, because he was there and they trusted him, right? His science is better because he has this community engagement aspect of it. So I'll leave with that in terms of making the case that I think one, obviously I really like to look at this ecological sort of perspective, partially because again, it's this big picture kind of behemoth that nonetheless has very specific concepts of what you're looking at, right? Like the trade-offs, the bioenergetics, constraints. But at the same time, if I want to do that well, I actually have to do it in community, because how can I measure the context if I don't know it, right? Other folks actually have to educate me on that. They are experts in their environment in a way that I am just not, even if I might have come, right? So in short, these are all the things that you can do to, like, again, but stop, collaborate, and listen. Thank you. Questions, thoughts, feelings, speakers?
Yeah. Thought. And a lot of students in the last, I don't know, 5 years have been saying, I really want to use my PhD to go into like science policy. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. I have no idea what that is. And they're like, I don't either. Can you help me figure it out? And I'm like,
Nope.
not really. But now I'm kind of like, okay, that makes a lot more sense. So there's a lot of students going into graduate school, and this is what they want to do with their PhD. They don't really know exactly what it looks like. They probably know what it looks like better than I do.
Yeah.
But this is what this cohort of students like in graduate school are kind of wanting to go do. So this was helpful for me. It's probably helpful for them too. So maybe like getting them in touch with like these types of resources.
Yeah, I mean,
helps.
Please email me. So I didn't go into the governance of CNI, but we have folks, including Francis Colon, who actually had a PhD in neuroscience, but then ended up being in like the advisory board, like the science advisory board for Obama, and then now is like working mostly on climate and climate policy, but she still has that connection to like how does climate impact development, right?
Yeah.
And health. So yeah, there are ways to get in, but I think a lot of that is also creative, and you don't know until you try it. So like, because of my connections, right, we got essentially the director of the special education in Syracuse where her work. She's just like, hey, we have these parenting groups and these other things, like you could give talks. And it was some students were like, they interested in like the neuroscience of parenting? We can also do anything, like it's right, like they're just interested, right? And I don't know how exactly that'll work out, but I think again, it's really like people over projects. If you have a long-standing relationship, you'll figure it out. you'll figure out ooh, that first one was a little too, not accessible. And then you'll refine it because you're in a process together. You're not in like a one and done transactional situation. Thanks. Starting your study about hierarchy and social groups, I was curious whether you found that if so, kind of processes that function. So because DLPC line of right, whether it is about flexibility. Yes. So yeah. Okay. Just see this. Yeah, a lot of our findings are in the DLPFC. And you're right, we normally think about, when we think about social rejection, we think about DACC and insula related to some say social pain, others, sort of violation of expectations, so on and so forth. We don't generally think about DLPFC, but it is there. And one of the putative sort of functions of it is possibly to do some sort of self-regulatory behavior. Now, we don't tell people, regulate yourself when this happens. Those studies that do actual emotion regulation manipulation have very clear, this is what the DLPFC is doing. We don't, right? So in some sense, we're making some sort of assumptions about what is the DLPFC doing in the context of social rejection. I have other data where it does appear like the DLPFC is related to essentially the degree of stress that, the NTS scale. Right, so it's related to subjective kinds of feelings. The important part is that the DLPFC is evolutionarily more recent, right? It has vast connections to all of these different, much more refined individual kind of mismatchy sort of things that are subcortical, right? And it is extremely expensive. So if you don't need to use it, just don't, right? If the locus ceruleus can do your attentional grabbing, leave that expensive DLPFC. So in some ways, even absent necessarily was it doing, but we think we know what it's doing. It's just the fact that it particularly is sensitive to this sort of the nutrient, the availability of this resource, whether it's social or it's literal nutrition. So it's particularly sensitive, and it will lower essentially its very expensive machinations if it sort of perceives like, oh well, there's something coming, there's something in the way, so there's less need to use all of this. It's not worth it. The cost benefit is different. The deal. See what I'm saying.
Maybe just to follow up on that. Yeah, because my understanding of the cyberball task, some of the circuits involved with it, was that DLPFC, dorsal anterior cingulate, sensitive to the expectancy violation aspects of it, as opposed to the social components, and as more the ventral anterior cingulate. That's a social part of this. So have you looked at ACC? Does it show a similar profile? And
yeah.
That distinction in this context.
Yeah. So what's interesting is this. I'm going to say this, and I feel like I'm going to have to figure out how it's related, but I've heard this before, and in particular, thinking about that the VMPFC is doing some sort of emotional, some sort of processing of the emotional components. And Naomi Eisenberger actually had said, well, maybe like the hand-holding stuff and the fact that there's lower activation, maybe it's actually the VMPFC is working hard to down-regulate these other regions. And what we find is that doesn't appear, that actually isn't true. So if you look at psychophysical interactions, it doesn't appear that this region is really, at least in the context of handholding and threat, does not appear to be the thing that is really reducing these other kinds of. As it relates to cyberball, again, what we're interested in is what are the neural correlates of yielding, and then how does sort of that capacity or whatever performance of yielding impact the response to social rejection. VMPFC wasn't one of the things that came out. So this is a whole brain cluster analysis that we get is actually these DLPFC, DACC components in cyberball. Suggestive that's just that yielding is apparently not acting upon the VMPFC. Maybe that does have something to do with some sort of expectancy violation or decision making. That would track, again, with this concept of yielding of you are reducing some sort of task. And maybe that task is not necessarily some sort of emotional kind of component, but maybe more on the decision making kind of, I hate to use a colder kind of component. But, so that's all, I mean, again, it's, you're looking at sort of the way that neural response in one context ends up impacting is related to response in another context. And it just so happens that VMPFC is not particularly related.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's the data. I guess it kind of begs consideration of the conclusion of the technical data, right? It's not a social rejection per se. There's something else.
Yeah, I mean, I say social rejection just because that was the task, but it is true. Like, what aspects of the task is the thing that the brain is that, like, what is it really in that task? Yeah, it could be different things, but yeah.
Are there any questions online?
There are no questions online.
Thank you.